Hey class, so today I want to begin talking about the apology of Socrates. And the first thing that we have to say has to do with the title. So the text is called The Apology. And as you read it, the thought might occur to you, this is a bad title because he doesn't apologize for anything. Well, you'd be correct in noticing that that's true. Socrates doesn't apologize for anything. The word apology is not really a translation of the title of the book as much as it is a transliteration, right? Which is to say, we just kind of found an English word that seemed to sound like the Greek word. The Greek word is apologia, and the apologia is, technically the defense speech. It's the term that they had for the speeches that you would give when defending yourself in a trial. So a more literal translation of the title would be the defense speech. Now, as it happens, there's actually three defense speeches, or there's three separate speeches in this text. And it's not immediately clear when you read the text that that's what's happening, but there are really three speeches, and this has to do with the structure of an Athenian trial. And this structure is further obscured by the fact that Plato does not give us any of the accuser's speeches. But in an Athenian trial, after the opening ceremonies, the accusers would give a speech accusing the defendant of wrongdoing. So that would be the first speech in the trial, is the speech of the accusers. The second speech, the apologia, would be the defendant's speech defending himself against the charges. Following that speech, the jury would vote on whether or not the defendant is guilty or innocent. If the defendant is found guilty, there would then be another round of speeches as we enter into the punishment phase. Again, the accusers would speak first, recommending a punishment, and then the defendant, who has now been found guilty, would give a speech recommending an alternative punishment. The jury would then have to choose between the two recommendations. Once they've made that choice, then there's a final speech where the defendant has an opportunity to address the court and say whatever it is that's on his mind or her mind before the punishment is carried out. So if you are found guilty, there would be three speeches. You would have your first defense speech when you are, just defending yourself against the charges. If you're found guilty, you'd then give another speech when you are recommending a punishment. And then you would have a third speech that you would be able to give after a punishment has been chosen. So that's three speeches. So Plato gives us all three speeches from Socrates, but none of the accuser's speeches. And in this video, I want to talk just about the first speech. Because the first speech, especially the first paragraph of the first speech, is very important for sort of setting up the issues at play in the text and, in a certain sense, in Socrates' career as a whole. So Socrates begins like this, and I'm reading from this version. Socrates says, "I do not know, men of Athens, how my accusers affected you. As for me, I was almost carried away in spite of myself. So persuasively did they speak, and yet hardly anything of what they said is true." Socrates sets up an important opposition or an important pair of opposed terms or ideas in this opening sentence or opening group of sentences, right? And that is truth and persuasion. Normally, we like to think that we are most persuaded by things that are true because we normally like to think that all of our beliefs are true, and in many cases we come to our beliefs by persuasion. But what Socrates is saying here is that his accusers were very persuasive, but none of what they said was true, in which case none of the beliefs formed on the basis of those speeches would be true. There's an opposition that Socrates is setting up between truth and persuasion. What that means is that the truth is not always persuasive, right? In many cases, the truth might be something that people don't want to hear, don't want to believe, or in some case are unable or unwilling to believe, and therefore, although one is speaking the truth, they are not speaking persuasively. On the other hand, the persuasive speaker may be telling people things that they want to hear, that feel good for them to believe, that sort of appeals to other preconceived notions or ideas that they already have, and therefore that speaker may be, completely, maybe speaking complete falsehoods, and yet persuasive. So Socrates sets up this opposition between truth and persuasion. And this is an important point that he's going to come back to again and again throughout the first speech, because why is it that the truth is not persuasive? And what are the consequences of the realization that the truth is not persuasive? Well, one consequence would be that most people don't know the truth. Because if we accept that a persuasive speaker would be able to persuade most people to, believe what he or she is saying, and after all, why would we call someone persuasive if they couldn't? So if we believe that, then we would have to believe that most people have false beliefs that they think to be true. So let's take that as one of Socrates' unspoken premises, that most people have false beliefs that they think to be true. You can think of Euthyphro here. He had a lot of false beliefs, but he was absolutely convinced that they were true. He was so convinced that his false beliefs were true that he was willing to put his father on trial for those false beliefs. But if Euthyphro is sort of a stand-in, maybe an exaggeration, but still representative of the majority of people, how then can one believe that Athenian democracy is a good form of government? In Athenian democracy, the majority rules. But if the majority has false beliefs, then you are being ruled by people with false beliefs. And it would seem that would be a bad situation, or at least not an optimal situation. Right? Socrates will suggest throughout the Apology and in some other texts as well that it's better to be ruled by people with knowledge. That would be to be ruled by people with true beliefs. Now, if the majority of people have false beliefs, that would mean only a few people have true beliefs. And that would mean that rather than having a democracy where the majority rules and we subject things to a vote, and whichever position or side or candidate gets the most votes carries the day, it seems to be that Socrates is suggesting that we embrace sort of undemocratic procedures where only those who have wisdom or knowledge would be allowed to rule. So there is an important sense in which Socrates' accusers are on the right track to be suspicious of him and to think of him as a threat to the city. It's very easy to fall into the trap when reading the Apology of thinking that, well, Socrates is the hero, the people that are accusing him are obviously, idiots, they're just closed-minded villains that, have no reason to attack Socrates except for that, they suck. And that's a reading that you see advanced by otherwise very sophisticated scholars, but it's not helpful and it's not particularly interesting. It's much more interesting to read the Apology understanding that while they may not ultimately be right, his accusers have a point. If Socrates is teaching his fellow citizens, especially his younger fellow citizens, that democracy is perhaps the worst form of government or one of the worst, and that the majority of the people should not be trusted to make their own political decisions or ethical decisions, then perhaps he is a threat to Athens, and perhaps he is corrupting the youth. In fact, the only way that one could maintain that Socrates is not corrupting the youth is not to challenge the facts of the case, but to challenge the interpretation of what constitutes corruption or improvement. And that's something that Socrates will do when he discusses that question with one of his accusers. So what will happen is that Socrates will have to argue that criticizing the foundations of democracy in Athens is not in fact corrupting the youth, but improving the youth. And that the only way that this can be a plausible claim, or the only way that this claim can seem plausible, is if one were to accept the view that the Athenian standard of the good life, of what constitutes, a happy, productive, well-lived human life, is wrong. That's the only way Socrates doesn't seem to be corrupting the youth. Because if the Athenian standard of what constitutes a happy, productive, and well-lived human life is correct, and Socrates is leading people away from that standard, then he's clearly corrupting them. If, on the other hand, Socrates is right that the Athenian way of life is not the best, and that the Athenian way of life is actually based on falsehoods and a misapprehension of the human good, then Socrates is correct and he is improving the youth and not corrupting them. So, long story short, in a certain sense, the ultimate question of Socrates' trial is not about the two things that he's charged with, which are corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods of the city. Those ultimately point towards a deeper and more profound question about the best way of life. Because if Socrates is correct, then the best way of life is to basically be like Socrates, and Socrates is improving the youth. So the only way to defend Socrates in this trial is to maintain that the Athenian way of life is flawed, and Socrates' influence on the youth, dragging them away from this way of life, is actually improving them. If Socrates' way of life is, however, not the best way of life, then his accusers are correct, and Socrates' education constitutes sort of a corruption. But how can Socrates prove to the people of Athens that his way of life is correct if he does not speak persuasively? If the arguments for the worst way of life are the more persuasive arguments? Right? There's a sense in which the only way Socrates could be acquitted in this trial would be to make every single citizen on the jury a philosopher, which is a very tough mark to reach. And so with that, I'm going to wrap up this first video on the apology, but I'm going to make a few others as we go through this text.